First, want to ask you about social media. My literature review for this project talked about social media having no limits like there are with TV scheduling and the potential for social media to really increase the popularity of women's sports. What do you think about that? Do you think, or do you feel like you can flood social media with content, get retweeted by men's sports journalists, and in doing so, set the media agenda and really put women's sports on people's minds?
So I think the women's sport, or at least my experience with women's sports, the way that social media has worked is that it's kind of a smaller pool of athletes and of fans. So I think especially 3, 4 years ago, and I think even so now, fans and media are able to connect with the athletes in a way that is harder to do when there are so many large followings or so many large brands. It's just much less of an individual thing. So in that respect, I think that social media has helped women's sports, and it's also kind of provided a space for fans to talk in a way that might not be as toxic as some men's sports are. I think that sometimes a lot of especially when you talk about the NFL or the NBA or MLB, I think that those have kind of grown to a point where people are very comfortable with kind of an anonymity of that then will kind of lead into some discourse that gets so far away from what's happening in the game. And I think for better or for worse, women's sports are not large enough to kind of have been in that stratosphere yet. So it's a net positive. I won't say there's not any issues at all with what women's sports kind of face in terms of the internet or social media, but I do think that it's still at a point where the good, in my opinion, is outweighing the bad.
Um, Obviously, the ideal is to also get women's sports more TV coverage. Can you speak to how, when they are shown in prime time, they have great success and it increases the popularity? And do you think journalists like yourself have the power to make a difference when you advocate for more TV coverage?
I think we've seen that, especially with the WNBA. But I think with the NWSL and with or sorry, now it's the PWHF, the new Women's Hockey League. We're seeing more and more TV coverage, and AU Athletes Unlimited just announced today that they were going to have some basketball on the ESPN family of networks too. And what I think we're seeing is year after year after year, we're seeing more and more women's sports events. And where I think that success comes from, when you think back to March Madness last year, is it comes hand in hand with the storytelling. It was Angel Reese and it was Caitlin Clark, and there was so much that had to do with the two of them specifically, so that when they did meet in the finals, people were able to be invested. And I think that's where journalists can come into play, is I think in helping to share the stories, because there are so many storylines. And I think that's true in kind of all sports, but women's sports in particular have never really had those stories told on a large platform. So I think that's, I'm an independent journalist in this space, and trying to work my way up. Um, but what we've seen to that end is there still are not lots of there's not much pregame or postgame or extra coverage. So that's some place that I feel like, myself specifically, I've worked hard to try and kind of close that gap a little bit. That's why I started live tweeting years ago, Liberty pressers, because I know that they're not available on TV. And I wanted fans to be able to hear what I was hearing in the room, because that wasn't going to be shared elsewhere outside of like maybe a choice quote that's in an article a few weeks after that. And I'm going to continue doing that until there's a point where we're seeing pre and post game TV coverage. And I hope that we get to that point, because that's going to kind of help fans keep coming back again and again. So there are small ways I think we can continue to build, but the numbers, I think, speak for themselves. They just keep on going up and up the more women's sports are on TV.
Yeah, I definitely love your tweets of the quotes from the press conferences from the players.
I appreciate that.
Um, so my next question was kind of along those lines. What are some of your strategies on social media? I guess that's one of them. And in your articles, to get creative and frame women's sports in a way that's exciting and that will increase the popularity.
I think with all writing, I have a background in fiction writing, actually, not in journalism per se. So I learned a lot of my journalism skills kind of on the fly. But whenever I am working on an article, I go back to a lot of those creative writing classes that I took in college and in grad school. Um, and I think that that has kind of helped me. And what I try to do is I try to start with something really grounded and then build off of it. So when you're telling when you're telling the story of a game, it's not just about what you're seeing, but you can always rely on those stats. But it's also trying to reinforce it with those quotes that you can find, or with what I was able to experience kind of being at a game or on the floor, and trying to find a way to marry that's grounded still in facts, but then is kind of painting the picture around it. So I think that that's kind of been my experience there. And it's as far as as far as I know, based on feedback, I think that that's been successful. Because I do know that access, and it kind of speaks to your last question, is still a barrier, right? Where I was talking to Dexter Henry and Christina Williams, so on an SNY New York Post hit after the finals, and Dex asked me, he was like, "Well, what are you going to take away from this Liberty Aces series?" And I had to talk about just how loud the Barclays Center was and how many fans were there, because that's something that, yes, on TV maybe they flash as you're coming in and out of commercial to the crowd, but unless you're in that building, and unless you were in that building in 2021 when they were building up right after they started allowing people in, when they after we were building back from COVID, to you would not be able to fully appreciate that. So like I think that's kind of an example of when I can use the eye test, but also reinforce it with the facts of how many people are kind of coming through. The fact that they're selling out the upper deck, and that normally that's reserved for the lower deck, and that was happening more and more frequently. But then to try to describe it as well as I could based on whatever other tools I have at my expense.
You talked about the storylines with Angel Reese and Caitlin Clark,
Mhm.
and that being really key to the promotion. Do you think men's sports fans love sports more for the storylines and the personalities, or the incredible feats of athleticism?
I think there's a lot that goes into it, because I think it's also somewhat cultural, right? It's just it's sports, and men's sports have been built in and normalized. And I think that women's sports were going a long way towards that. But I've seen it even in my coverage. It was, a couple of years ago, and this still happens, but a couple of years ago, if you asked any college athlete, any college basketball player who was coming up and trying to go to the WNBA, who her favorite athlete was, it would always be LeBron James or Steph Curry. And now you're hearing a lot more, Candace Parker's or Diana Taurasi or whatever it is. And I think that that is partially due to the fact that they are finally able to watch some of these games. Access wasn't always there. So I think so yeah, it's kind of a complex question, right? Because there's what's around you, what's part of just the cultural conversation, but it's also what do you have in front of you? And I think that yes, we have these documentaries, we have The Last Dance, and we have, all of these things on the men's side. We have 30 for 30s that we keep on watching and keep on putting out. And now I think even more on the men's side, we've also got lots of former athletes that have podcasts, and they're taking the narratives themselves. And we're seeing more of that from the women, especially as they get to retirement age. Or you look at some players like Haley Jones, who has her own podcast too, and I think that helps tell the stories. But when you're talking about like the engagement of a fan, I think it gets a lot more complex, because whenever you look at the valuation, and there have been Goal Sports did a study a couple of years ago that said one of the appeal for businesses is that women's sports fans engage much more, and what that on social media, and what that translates to is dollars per per fan, women's sports fans are much more likely to say, this is something I'm passionate about and I want to let you know, so I'm going to put my dollars into it. And part of that is because there were all of these barriers to access where you had to hunt down on a half dozen channels, or your jersey, the jersey that you wanted was only available from one or two retailers, so you really had to like go out and find it. And that kind of created this very, very tough fan. And that's not how it should be. But on the men's side, everything has been, they've gone through a lot of these struggles, and these leagues are just more developed and longer developed, I should say, than the WNBA, which is entering its 28th season now. So like that's part of it too. I don't know. I don't know though if I would agree that men's sports fans are not necessarily like as passionate about the sports. I think the availability has just kind of made it easier to be passionate.
Yeah. Um, so in doing my literature review, I also found that there was a source that said some fans don't like when female athletes post too many pictures of themselves engaging in their personal lives and not enough of them engaging in their sport. But I found another source that said fans of women's sports respond better to feature articles about the athletes' personal lives than to stories about their statistics. So, which do you think is more important, selling personalities or selling athletic competence? Or do you think you need a mix of both?
I think if you have the right personalities, you should absolutely kind of take advantage of that. I was talking to someone the other day about how many of the major men's professional leagues do you think wishes they had somebody like Asia Wilson that they could put in front of everything? Someone who is not just elite on the court, but is also charismatic and is also just, now she's an author, and she's just kind of all over the place and just brings such positive energy and is so inspirational. I think you look at Major League Baseball has had a real problem for the last decade, 2 decades, with finding a superstar, right? That they could really identify with. I think the NFL, lots of these guys, we know a lot about quarterbacks, but most of these dudes are like under helmets. So not a lot of people outside of saying that's a giant person walking towards me would be able to identify some of those stars. The NBA has done somewhat better. And I think that that's partially what the success on the women's side for the W is anyway, is that it is, while still a team sport, maybe the most individual of all the major sports because it's 5-on-5. Um, but yeah, I think that if you have the personalities, then it's a great thing to use them. And there are different types of fans. And I think that the WNBA being a league that is so open to it's a league that's majority queer women, it's majority Black women. I think that that's underserved portions of the population already. So when you're talking about that, I think that makes telling those stories even more important, and it makes the sport feel bigger than kind of what's just between the lines. It's something that the W has had to grow into because that was not always the case. A lot of the players were trying to fit into a mold in the early years of the W, where they were trying to make this the family sport, and it was mothers and daughters, and that was kind of what the idea was. But before it's kind of grown into what it is today. But my wife, for example, doesn't care for sports much, but she when she sits down to watch a game with me, she's like, okay, so who's married to who in this game? What's some of the tea that I need to know? Oh, they used to be friends. I remember they were on the same team. And like there are different ways to interact with sports and to tell stories. So um I think it's a benefit. I don't think it needs to be one or the other. I think as long as it's done well and done respectfully, there's room for both, where you can have the storytelling, but then you can also just have whatever's happening on the court too, and you can appreciate both by themselves. But I think it's the most powerful when you can really appreciate it in conjunction, because man, when someone wins their first title and then you know their whole story and you know how hard they fought for it and everything they've had to overcome and the barriers that have been put in their way, I feel like it's even more special than just resonating with I'm a fan of this team because I grew up in this city. You can be a fan of the player and the person, and really, I think that just takes that to a whole nother level.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Asia because I was going to ask you about the Aces and Asia Wilson, Cindy Colson, all the comedy, and if they're making your job easy when it comes to selling women's sports. So,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah, absolutely. I think that the Aces specifically, I I haven't seen a team like them. I'm just saying, in my experience covering a team, sure, but also just it's rare. I'm from New York, so I'm seeing a little bit of that in this current Knicks team, where it's a similar build because it's three guys that all went to college together, and like you can kind of build a culture that way, which is really hard to do in professional sports because you have to think that like all of these players come from disparate backgrounds, and there's often an age gap of a dozen years between the youngest players and the oldest players. But the Aces had this really rare situation where they had three back-to-back-to-back number one overall picks that were then able to kind of grow together and all kind of be close to the same age and build that culture and have time to thrive. The average WNBA player doesn't survive 3 years in the league. So when you talk about the continuity that they have in Vegas, I think that a lot of it goes to the fact that these are players that have been able to learn together, have been able to grow together, and really truly love each other. And yeah, that absolutely makes my job easier. And I think we all should be just kind of grateful for the joy that they play with, rather, and it's not just the joy, but it's also the excellence too. So kind of put those both together, and it's a really fun formula.
Um, what do you think about the underdog story of women, them being discriminated against in so many ways, both in sports and outside sports? Everybody loves an underdog story. So do you think that gives women's sports an appeal that men's sports actually don't have?
Uh, it's tough because I wish that that narrative didn't have to exist, right? I wish that it didn't have to be an uphill battle, that it didn't have to be um, coming from a place where we're seeing it as improvement and as a little victory. That now, when you see the comments under a post, it's not all the go back to the kitchen comments or whatever. And like we're actually starting to see more casual fans take women's sports seriously. Um, it kind of sucks, right? That every little victory you then have to look back at and say, remember when it was worse. And it's still not where it needs to be. And women in this country are still paid pennies on the dollar. And again, it exponentially gets worse when you talk about Black women, when you talk about queer women. And I think that the W being an example of success is great, but we also haven't done enough. And that's why so many eyes are going to be on the next TV rights deal, which comes due next year. Because yes, we had the CBA in 2020 that but that was like getting out of the Stone Ages, right? And getting into the Bronze Age. That was not getting them to where they should be today. And I think that there's still so much more to be done. But yes, we can absolutely celebrate, the minor successes as they come, while knowing that there's still so many loftier goals still out in front of us.
So we talked about the aces. I also wanted to ask you about the other big name out there, Caitlin Clark. What do you think her success and the way that Stephen A and ESPN are covering her has really done for women's sports?
So that's definitely two separate questions. I think that she's phenomenal. And I think that it's great that Caitlin is drawing this many eyes. And I also do think that we have very short memories because Megan Gustafson was before her there in Iowa, also selling out, helping to sell out those arenas. And Caitlin is not the first, nor will she be the last inspirational college player that's breaking records. I'm sure Juju will be coming for everything that Caitlin is laying out in front of her right now. But that being said, she's really just such a phenomenal talent and continuing to just be an inspiration for not just the next generation, but current generation of athletes too. Um, but I do have a problem with how just kind of mainstream media, and I don't want to single out Stephen A. But like there are so many people at the major networks that do not treat women's sports at all with much respect unless there's, a major record being broken. And even then, I can't tell you how many times I've seen a Sports Center highlight where the announcers on Sports Center just don't know the names of the players that they're reading. So it's very clear that they're not familiar. And I understand there are lots of sports in the world. If I had to read, soccer highlights or rugby highlights, like I would be lost myself. But what they should be able to do at ESPN specifically, I think, if you're going to call yourself the worldwide leader, is put people in positions that know what's going on. And they've done that a little bit in recent years, but do it more. Invest, really invest, especially for as long as you've got these TV rights, because they still for now control the television rights for the WNBA. And for so long, they were responsible, excuse me, they were responsible for kind of holding the league back. And it's really only in recent years that we've started to see more and more games put onto TV. And then that leads to some of that success that you were talking about. So I think that they have a responsibility to grow the league, having those rights.
Yeah, I totally agree. I wish we could see it be about more than just Caitlin.
Same, same.
My last question is, are there any other strategies you want to mention that I haven't thought of, or any closing thoughts?
In terms of ways to grow the game,
Yeah, the popularity, yeah.
I think one thing that I think is really, really important, where I do love so much of what this league has done in recent years, but one part that is still sorely lacking is the availability of merchandise. I think if you want to make fans for life, then when they go to a game, if they see, I don't know, Benai Laney hit 6 threes that game and then shut down the other team's best player and secure the liberty of victory, you should be able to go online right after that and get a jersey and have it at your house in a couple of days, just as you would on the men's side. Every player, I think merch needs to be available. And not only that, it needs to be available for kids. That's a huge problem right now. It's oftentimes also unisex sizing, so it needs to be available for both men and women. Not all of these women's sports jerseys should not be cut for men. I think that's really, really tough. But yeah, merch, I think that's where you start really in growing the fandom, because then you have these people you've got a kid that goes to the park wearing his or her Benai Laney jersey, and then someone says, "Oh, that's cool. What's that about?" And that starts a conversation, and then that can build and build. Or I have a bunch of friends that have toddlers, and I get them. I think 6 of them all have the exact same matching little Liberty onesie because it's the only one available. And I wish there were jersey options and customization that you could do. So I think that that's a spot that the league can really help itself out.
All right, well, thank you, Miles. I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been great.
Of course, of course. Thanks so much, Zach.